Hello, everyone. Welcome to Working with SharePoint Files and Lists. My name is Jeremy Kelly. I'm a Senior Program Manager with the OneDrive and SharePoint team, and I focus on our API platform. Today, we're going to do a quick overview, and then we're going to talk about a couple different topics. We're going to talk about enumerating SharePoint sites. We're going to talk about what's new in sites and lists, and then we're going to talk about our brand new Taxonomy API that you may have played with in our beta endpoint. First off, for those that are new to Microsoft Graph, it is definitely our focus in the SharePoint and OneDrive org for extensibility. And we really have two areas that we try to push on. One is completeness, and we're aiming to make sure that Microsoft Graph enables you to build any of the experiences that you see in our modern SharePoint and OneDrive UX using our extensibility. So all of the things that you can do, we want to make sure those are the APIs that are carried over into Microsoft Graph for you to work with. Our second focus is on performance. We want to make sure that these APIs are the best way, most performant way to talk to SharePoint and OneDrive data in Microsoft Graph or through any of our other platforms as well. For those who've been with us for a while, you may have solutions built with SharePoint CSOM. And that's still a path that is necessary sometimes, and obviously you may have applications that have not been updated to use Microsoft Graph. For those of you in that situation, earlier this year, we released a version of SharePoint CSOM that is now compatible with .NET Core applications. So you can build targeting any .NET Core app that you need to, or framework, like Azure Functions, and make that work. This was available earlier in the year, and it's in the same package as the .NET Standard release as well. So you don't need to worry about switching between the two. Let's talk about site enumeration. This has been a problem area for SharePoint for a very long time. We've never had a great solution for how to figure out what all the sites in your tenant might be. In the past, we've used search, which kind of worked, but it was actually very difficult to solve this problem. What we've done is add a new API, already available on 1.0, that allows you to get the full list of all site collections in your tenancy. This includes both team sites, communication sites, as well as OneDrive for Business drives. This is used primarily with application only authentication. We do not security trim the list, which is why that's the case. Therefore, you only want to give access to the list to applications that you trust to have access to your entire tenancy. It returns a simple collection of site objects. And for scenarios, this is really useful if you're doing anything that is broad scale, security scanning, auditing, that type of scenario where you need to know all of the content. And if you're in that pattern, you're going to want to look at our scan guidance that's available to tell you the best way to accomplish that performantly. We've already updated that guidance with information about site enumeration, so you'll be ready to go. The endpoint is very simple. It's the sites endpoint. If you're familiar with Microsoft Graph, you might say, but that already existed, and you would be right. Sites endpoint today enumerate all of the root sites in a multi-geo tenancy. Going forward, the basic sites query will return all of the site collections. So the existing libraries that you have will already work and return the data that it expects to return. In addition, we support webhooks as a resource. So /sites in your webhooks resource registration works just fine. And we're supporting Delta Query as well, which will be available in beta. We should go to 1.0 fairly quickly, but it's going to initially start in beta as we roll out. Let's take a look at how we might actually use this in practice. As a scenario for our demo today, we're going to think about a system that we might want to schedule follow-ups based on new sites being created. So imagine you have a tenancy where you're creating customer connection sites. And each time one of those customer connection sites is created, you want to add to a list in order to make sure that people are following up. So we're going to use that as the basis for a couple of our demos. And we're going to start with the site enumeration demo. So what are we going to learn as we go through this demo? We're going to learn how to enumerate the sites. We're going to learn how to subscribe to events on those sites so that when new sites are created, we get notified. And then we're going to learn how to process the changes. So in terms of technology, we're going to need a few bits that we're going to go through in the demo. We're going to learn how we establish an app-only context. We're going to use the sites endpoint for scanning. We're going to subscribe to our webhook for our notifications. And then we're going to use Delta to actually get the list of what's new. First thing we want to do with our application is make sure that we have app-only authentication set up correctly. In order to do this, we're actually going to use certificates to prove our app's identity. There are cases with the SharePoint low-level APIs where if you're not using a certificate with app-only auth, it will throw an error. So we want to make sure we're using certificates. I've created a helper function which is going to load a certificate from Key Vault, which I've uploaded both to my application registration in Azure and to the Key Vault section as well, so I can pull it out at runtime. If we take a look where I call this helper function from, you can see we get the certificate and then we pass it in to use with our confidential client builder. So once we do this and get everything set up, we're going to have a good app-only token based on a certificate that we're going to use to make all of our graph calls. Let's take a look at the core logic we wanted to actually execute in our application. So if we run down the order of the things we talked about, we're going to get the list of all sites to figure out whether or not the site that goes with our application exists. We're actually going to use the Delta query in order to generate the full list of sites again in order to find all of the sites that may have been created previously. We're going to do that so that we have a good Delta token to get changes with later instead of the full list. Once we do that, we're going to loop through the list. We're going to look for all the ones that match the identifier that we want, and we're going to add them to our list. So if we start with the first bit, let's just enumerate all of the sites. Let's take a look at this helper function right here. Does application site exist? If we look, this is fairly simple. We call a get all site collections method, and then we loop through looking for the site ID. In this case, I've hard-coded the site ID for this particular application site. I used Graph Explorer to pull it out. That was the easiest way to make sure that I could reliably get the site. You can use whatever method you find most convenient, but I used Graph Explorer to pull that ID out and then save it. If we look at get all site collections, this is going to be really simple. This is one of the things that I really like about the enumerate sites API, because there's nothing super special about it. We get our graph client and we say sites.request.getAsync. I'm using the .NET SDK for graph in order to make this easier. Super handy, works great for both .NET Core apps and other apps as well. It returns back paged results, so I do a loop to make sure that I keep asking for sites while I have next pages, adding them to my list of sites, and then I'm going to return it. Why don't we take a quick look and stop here and see what does this part get us? So I've created a view that we will use just to do that, just to show all the site collections without going into the rest of the application logic. So I've got a link here. We're running inside of the application that I've set up. For most daemon apps, you may not actually want UX. In this case, for the demo purposes, I wanted to be able to show it to you. So we'll click Show All Site Collections. It's going to call the Sites API. It's going to generate all of the information. And voila, I've got a table that I've created here with the display name of each site and its web URL that comes back. And if we look, we will see both SharePoint site collections like the Contoso site here, as well as OneDrive for Business site collections as well for each user. If I were to go in here and actually click through, let's find, oh, here's one of the ones that I think we're going to want to use in a minute, our first customer site. So if I click more, then I can use the Graph API as well to do things like list out all of the drives, list out all of the lists that are available in this site collection, and get more metadata. So there's our basic first bit that we're going to use in our application. The second step, if we scroll back up to the top, was using the Delta query. So we have, or the next step is actually to get the list inside of the site collection that we're going to write to. And in this case, the list probably doesn't exist if we just created the site. So we're going to create it if necessary. And let's take a look. This is fairly standard Microsoft Graph code here as well. We're just going to get all of the lists using the list API. We can see that right here, again, using the SDK. Sites, target site ID, lists, request, get async, turns me page results of lists. So I get all of those back. I loop through and look. In this case, instead of by ID, we're going by name because I'm going to dynamically create it. So I won't know at compile time what my ID is, but I can look for the scheduled follow-ups list. If we found it, then great, we'll just return it so we can use it. And if not, we'll go ahead and create it. Again, really basic Microsoft Graph calls here. I'm going to establish a set of columns that we're going to use, and then we're going to go ahead and return that list as well. Once we have the list, then we're going to call Delta. Delta is going to give us the list of all site collections because we're going to call Delta without actually passing in a token. So let's take a look over at our Delta helper that I created here. And again, this is just wrapping some code that is going to make it easier for us to use over and over again. So I've got retrieve site Delta changes from Microsoft Graph, and I take a flag to say whether I want the initial Delta or not. On the initial Delta, we're just going to call sites Delta. The graph hostname and graph version number make it easier for me to swap back and forth between beta and release. In this case, Delta is on beta. So when it goes to 1.0, I can easily update my application. Since it's in beta and I'm not using the beta SDK, I'm making a direct call, and I can still use the graph client in order to authenticate my request and make my HTTP call. So sites Delta is going to return me a list of site information. In this application, I have a helper type that it's going to come back as the sites Delta result. You can interrogate the JSON yourself to see how that works, but it's fairly straightforward. Once I've got the Delta result, if we go back over to our other call, really simple. We're just going to loop through the list of site information that came back, and then we're going to look for any site that starts with CCC:space. You could use other fields in order to identify the kind of sites you're looking for. I used the name field because it was very easy to do. Sure, this has all the issues that you would find with someone accidentally creating sites. I figured the CCC: was unlikely to be something that would collide in the future. And once we find that, we're just going to go ahead and add it to the list that we created earlier. So let's take a look at what that part gets us. So we're going to go back over to our application. Actually, before we do that, let's take a look at the site. So this is the site that we are working with, the Contoso Customer Connection site. You can see it does not have the list that we want. So we're going to come back over to our app, and we're going to call the setup application data method, which is what we were just looking at with all of our code. And that's going to go ahead, it's going to go out, it's going to look for that site, it's going to look to see whether that site already has the list in it. And if it does, it will return it. We know it doesn't because we just looked at it. So it will create the list. And then it's going to loop through, you can see here, the results that came back from Delta, and it found all of these sites out of that total set that we saw earlier that it's now going to add. So we can go verify that over in the site contents page. We can refresh this, and you can see we now have a scheduled follow-ups list, and it has each of those customers added with some default values that I could now go in and follow up. So this is great. This bootstraps the basic part of our app. We can search through the set of sites that have already been created and be able to record items in this list. So what happens when we want to actually get new sites? Well, the easiest way to find the new sites is to register for a webhook and then process those notifications. So we have a register for new site notifications with graph method. Let's go take a look at that. And this is just going to create a subscription type for Microsoft Graph, and it's going to use the resource sites. This is the same as every other subscription that you'll create for Microsoft Graph. You can see in this case, I have a time offset of 30 days. SharePoint does support 30-day webhook expirations. Docs to be updated soon. But this is fairly straightforward. Register my notification, and you can see we've got our path here is going to be notification new site. Let's take a look at what that's actually going to do for us. So I've got another controller over here that's going to have, we can see here, the new site endpoint. It's going to take a validation token. So the first time that we register, it's going to make a call to this endpoint, and we're going to need to return the validation token just to make sure that we act with the system that this is working and that our service is here, so that it will keep sending us notifications. And then in the future, when we get a regular notification, we're just going to read it out. It's going to give us a set of notifications that come back, and then we're going to process the new site notification right there. If we look at what that does, we're going to check that we got the client state that we expected. So we're going to make sure that the webhook is actually the webhook we want it to be. We're going to make sure that it's a sites notification, so we didn't accidentally register another drive notification, for example, on the same endpoint. We're going to keep track of what the new sites that we got were. So we're going to use our Delta helper again. We're going to make the same call we made before to get the changes, only this time we're going to say, don't make the initial call, just get me the new stuff. We're going to go through the list of sites that come back, and again, we're going to add it to our list. So if we go over to our site again, we're going to go to the SharePoint home. Oh, just took it a minute to render. I'm going to create a new site. Create a team site. We're going to call it CCC : oh, missed a C. Demo customer. We're just going to create this. We'll leave all the other settings default. We will finish creating the site. And now what's going to happen is a timer job is going to run, which is going to go discover that this site exists and adds it to the list of sites returned by site enumeration. Once that happens, we're going to get a webhook notification that the site was created, and we're going to go add it to the list. Since webhooks and the timer job can take a few minutes, we're going to make a quick edit here, and we'll come back when the site has been created, and we'll take a look back over in our list when the new site appears. All right, now we can see that our new site has been added as a new customer, fantastic demo customer down here at the back. We set all of these items to default in our list item adding method. We didn't fill in a next follow-up because we don't know yet what the next follow-up time is going to be. But I think we've got the start of a great app here where we will be able to respond to new sites being created for our particular business case, and then take action on them. And we'll see in our later demo some more bits that we could add here that I think will make this even more valuable. All right, that was a great demo. I'm excited for everyone to be able to play with the site's endpoint and let us know what you think. We're always open to feedback on the new endpoints that we're opening up. So let's take a look at what's new for sites and lists and what's coming soon. In sites and lists, this is a very core area for SharePoint, obviously, and it's one that we've had a little bit less coverage of in the past. And so there are a few areas that we really want to enhance. Number one, we're bringing the localization settings for sites to the API. So you'll be able to get the language and time zone associated with a site. So you can do localization and really target your content and your application better. Additionally, we're adding new column types to the list API. So obviously, columns are kind of core to lists. We have not yet had full coverage on all of the different types that you can create in SharePoint. We have several coming very soon, and our goal is to support all of the same types as the UX allows. So very soon you'll see location, approval status, term and multi-term for the Taxonomy API that we're going to see very soon as well. We're also finally adding support for list views. I believe we announced this quite a while back, actually, and we are now in the process of rolling this out as well. So you'll be able to configure the views that you show to your users in the list UX using the Microsoft Graph API. We've also added list item count, which seems like a really basic property, but it means that you'll no longer have to actually query the list in order to find out how many items are in it. So this will come back right on the list metadata itself, and that should be a very handy property to have. Obviously, we have more coming than just this over time, but this is what's coming soon, and you should be on the lookout for in the short term. Let's talk about the taxonomy service. Taxonomy was actually one of the first things that I was exposed to in SharePoint when I joined the team many years ago now. And so it's a little near and dear to my heart, and I'm excited that we're finally getting a modern API surface on it. This has been one of our top requests, both for Microsoft Graph and the SharePoint REST APIs before that. So we're excited that this is finally being available. It's available now on the beta endpoint. It provides access to the term store and all of the things that go with it. I'm not going to give a too deep of an overview on how taxonomy and the term store works in terms of the architecture and what the best ways to set it up are. You may want to look for some of our other sessions on modern content types and taxonomy to find the more guidance there. But we are going to focus on the things that you can actually do with it in the API. So we have all the common things you would expect, like enumerating the groups, getting the term sets, and then working with the actual terms, as well as the API supports pinning and reuse. So those are a lot of complicated advanced features that you can get into with the Taxonomy API, and there are great solutions and scenarios you can fulfill using those APIs. So we're excited for those to be out in the world, and let's actually do a demo of how these work and some ways we might be able to take advantage of them. So what are we going to learn about the term store? Obviously the basics in this case, how to read from it, and then how to add term groups, term sets, and terms. In terms of our flow for this demo, we're going to do the gets. We're going to create a new term group if it doesn't exist. So we'll actually iterate through the groups that are there, look to see if a target group exists, and if it doesn't, we'll create it. We'll create the term set underneath the group, and then we'll create whatever terms we decide we need in order to fulfill the scenario that we're looking at. I think it would be really cool if we added some taxonomy elements to our demo scenario. So I think we could add a new set of terms that would allow us to plug into the list that we already created. So for those of you who are new to taxonomy, I recommend going and getting an overview from some of our other content that's available. But the important thing to know for this demo is that it's basically a hierarchy. We have groups, groups have sets, and sets have terms. Sets also exist at their own top level, and we'll see that when we get into the code. But this is just a quick view of our term store where we manage the taxonomy through UX. But this is a developer demo, so we don't want to manage through UX. We want to manage through code. So let's take a look at how we could do this on our own. If we come over here, I've built the shell of an app. This application, unlike our previous one, is actually going to connect using delegated permissions because we need permission to be a term store manager in our app. Therefore, we need to act as one of the users who has that permission already. We can't yet use application-only permissions when we're writing to the term store. That's something we're obviously working on, but as of today, it requires delegated permissions with the appropriate user. And we have two functions that we can do here. We can show the term store and we can configure our default terms. Let's take a look at how we might show the term store in code, similar to how we did with the site enumeration. So we'll come over to Visual Studio and we'll see that I've created a method called getTermStoreHierarchy. And this is going to be very simple. We're going to get all of the groups. We're going to then, for each of the groups, we're going to get all of the sets in those groups. And for each set, we're going to find all of the terms that are underneath it. Let's take a look at how we actually do this. So we have get all term store groups. Again, very easy path in Microsoft Graph. So we have /term store, which is the top level, /groups. And that is going to return us the list of term groups that are available. Because this is pre-release, again, this is in beta, I've created a couple helper classes that will model the term groups and term sets. So you'll see some of these classes that when they're available through the Microsoft Graph SDK, you won't necessarily have to do some of this work on your own. But for the purposes of showing off the demo today, we've got some extra helper methods and classes defined. So we can get all of the groups. When we're getting sets, we can do the same thing. And as I mentioned, sets exist both as children of groups and at their own top level. So in this case, I've created a get all term sets from group, where I'm going to take in the parent group. And I'm just going to ask for the sets underneath the group that matches the ID. So this parameter here is parent group.id. And we're just going to replace that. We're going to get back the set of sets, and then we'll be all set. Last bit here, for the final level of the hierarchy, we're going to get all terms from the set. And similar to what we did for the groups and the sets, we're actually going to go to the top level. We're going to ask for a set based on its ID and then return the children. Now, if you know anything about the taxonomy system today, you know that terms can have their own children. Like this hierarchy can get quite deep, depending on your scenario. It's very powerful, very flexible. For the purposes of this demo, I only went one level deep. You could very easily recursively keep getting children and rendering the lists that way. I think you'll see when we pop over to our UX that for this scenario, it didn't make sense to go any deeper. So why don't we do that? Let's go take a look at what our user experience for this will do. And I'm going to warn you up front, if you are a web developer who has any measure of skill with HTML and CSS, this UX may give you flashbacks to the time of blink tags and dancing hamsters and other very basic and now considered inappropriate HTML design. So I'm just giving you that heads up as we click in here. to see what our term store looks like. And we've already seen the term store UX in the admin center, but this is my wonderful rendering of the same data. So you can see here we have our groups. Here's the people group. We have the created date and time, the ID, the set name, the language tag that goes with it, and then each of the individual terms and their various labels. If we scroll down, we can keep seeing, here's another group, the search dictionaries, and the system group that has the hashtags and keywords that are stored in the system. So fairly easy, fairly straightforward just to render out the taxonomy in the service. I don't necessarily recommend rendering your entire taxonomy all the time. It will get costly to do so. So as a demo, I think this works, but for your application, you probably want to stay focused on the term sets and groups that you're actually using. So let's go back and see, we saw basically the built-in groups here, and we really want to create the groups that might be useful for our application. So if we look at our home controller, we had another link on our UX, which was to actually create the term store defaults. So we have a method for creating the defaults, and we're going to go call create term store default values if necessary over in our helper. And then we'll render out the set of things that we actually created. So if we look here, here's our helper method, create term store default values if necessary. We're going to clear out any existing data just in case, so we don't have old state mixed in with new state. And then we're going to get the default term group and create it. So in this case, we're going to do a read, similar to what we did before, and then we're going to look for the term group that we want. So we have a hard-coded name here, the Contoso Customer Connection Group, and we're just going to look for that in the set of groups that come back. If we had it, then we're going to go on to the next set here. Or if we didn't have it, rather. If we didn't have our default term group, we're going to create it. So we're going to declare a new term group. We're going to set its display name, its description. We're going to set an ID to null. And then we're going to format a URL. Our URL is just going to be, we're going to post to the term store groups collection. We're going to serialize some JSON in there for this object that we created. And then we're going to authenticate the request and send it over using our graph client. When it comes back, we'll make sure that we got a success code, and we'll actually return that group back up the chain. If we keep going the next level down, it's going to get a little bit different when we create the default term set. So similarly to the previous level, we're actually going to ask a particular group to check all of its sets, and we're going to look for the customer account type term set. And then when that comes back, we're actually going to format some raw JSON and pass that along, just as an alternative to using the JSON serialization method. We're going to create the content. We're going to pass that over again, do a send. This is similar to the previous one. This is a post method, and we're posting directly to the sets that exist at the top level rather than under the group. So we make the association between the set and the group by passing in the parent group ID when we create it, but we're actually doing the creation at the top level. And if we look, the last layer here, we're creating the default terms. I have 3 terms that I want to create. I want to create basic, deluxe, and premier. And we're going to call a create term method. If we scroll down to create term, it's going to be very similar, except that this time we are going to create these terms as a child of a set. So there's no top level terms collection that I need to work with. I'm actually adding these directly to the set. And again, we're just formatting some raw JSON, passing in the labels. In this case, I'm setting the language to ENUS. Again, see more taxonomy documentation for more advanced things you can do with the various language settings. And then we're going to post again to the collection, create our term. So all fairly straightforward. Working with the object model, you'll want to actually read our documentation to make sure you understand the associations between groups, terms, and sets. But overall, fairly easy to get set up, not all that complicated. So let's go take a look at our application again. We'll go back here and we'll try configure customer connection default terms. We'll see what happens. All right, so we got back our group, our set, and our terms. That all looks good. Why don't we go back over to the admin center, refresh the page. And here we are, Contoso customer connection, customer account type. If we expand this, then we've got basic, deluxe, and premier. So we've programmatically created the hierarchy that we want our app to be able to use. And what we could do now is we could go back to our previous scenario where we were setting up our list and actually create the taxonomy columns that we want to use. Those features, as I mentioned, are coming soon to lists. They're not quite available. But from a scenario point of view, that's likely what I would do. I would probably create these terms actually first and then use them in a list. If I wanted to, I could go directly to the list itself right now and add the column. And we'd be all set. And then we'd have a nice taxonomy bound column associated with our applications data. All right, taxonomy is out, available in beta. That's great. So let's take a quick recap of what we learned today. CSOM for .NET Core is available. That was one of our top requests on user voice. We're excited that's done, and you can all take advantage of it today. Site enumeration, same thing, a very top request from a lot of people over the years on a consistent, performant way to do that, and we're glad that API is now available for you to use. Lots coming in lists. Expect not only the things that I talked about today, but even more over the coming months to be available in Microsoft Graph. And last but certainly not least, the Taxonomy API, which is going to open up whole new worlds of possibility for you in the applications that you build targeting Microsoft Graph and Microsoft 365. If you are building a large-scale application, as I mentioned earlier, please check out our scanning guidance. This is going to help you learn the right ways to handle throttling, the right ways to handle events and notifications, and how best to understand the entire corpus of content within a SharePoint tenancy and have the best shot at having an efficient application ready to go. So thank you very much for watching today, and we hope to hear your feedback soon.